if you're a doctor with maybe any sort of advanced skill set, like you do one thing, maybe ortho, maybe you do an implant, maybe you do some extractions, grafting, maybe you do molar root canal, like not even a crazy skill set, your benchmark numbers should be at least $80,000 a month. If you're not doing $80,000 a month, what I will tell you is that there are some fundamental issues there that are not being met.
Welcome back to the Millennial Dentist Podcast, a podcast all about working smarter, not harder. Pushing dentists to go beyond dental school dentistry and build the practice of your dreams. Here is your host, the Millennial Dentist himself, Dr. Sully Sullivan.
Welcome back to the Millennial Dentist Podcast. All right, so here we go. We're going to talk about today, just jumping in there, really how to know if you're over-teamed, if you're underproducing. If you're underproducing, how do we just figure out where the production needs to come from? Maybe a little bit of allocation and shares in that regard. Should be good. Let's roll. All right, so first and foremost, what we have to do is we have to understand what our baseline metric is for kind of relative profitability or overhead. And so what we find is that the first metric to look at is going to be your team compensation. Team compensation is important because it typically makes up somewhere between 25 and 30% of the practice of the overall overhead. That's a significant portion. You think about something like supplies, and everybody wants to get on these Facebook groups and be like, oh my gosh, where can I get cheaper cotton rolls? And it's like, oh great, to save 1%, 2%. Like that is not really super needle moving. I mean, I'm not saying it's not helpful, I'm just saying it's not needle moving. So we can generally tell if a practice is in or out of line in profitability pretty quickly by looking at team overhead. So you think about it, okay, what are your two biggest parts of a business overhead? One is the dentist, they're number one. The dentists themselves is going to be 30 to 35%. And then you're going to have the team. That makes up the bulk of the overhead. Then you've got all these other things that come into play. So team compensation is a great place to start. Total team compensation is going to include their annual salaries, hourly pay, whatever, just salary. Just try to annualize it. Ultimately, we need to get to a monthly number, but annualize it, divided by 12, whatever works. It's going to include their pay, the payroll taxes, all the things that basically cost to have this employee. Retirement benefits, uniforms, health insurance, whatever goes towards team compensation outside of bonuses is going to go into your total team compensation. This number should be a percentage, should be somewhere between 20 and 30%. 25% is typically the number we shoot for. If you're a fee-for-service practice, you're going to be closer to 20. If you're a PPO practice, you'll be closer to 25. What underproducing practices typically are, or even over-teamed, is they're going to get up to 30%. What I want people to understand when it comes to team overhead is, and I've talked a lot of this in our mastermind program recently, but I don't like goals. Goals is a 1 point number. I like a margin or a window of number, meaning like my goal to produce is like not 80 grand. I have a minimum of 70 and a maximum of 90. That's a podcast episode for a different time. But like you get the point in that like I want to have this kind of like window. So I want you to think about on the low end, I want my team overhead to be 20%. On the high end, I want it to be 30%. When I am in growth mode, I'm trying to grow the practice, I'm most likely going to need to be potentially over-teamed for a little bit. You think about it, you hire a new team member that's not going to impact the practice immediately. Therefore, that may bump you up to a higher number. What I don't want to do is go above 30. So if I'm already at 30%, I'm like, I need more team, then I'm probably going to tell you that you're either overpaying current people that you have or you're underproducing. We have to figure that out. We'll get to that part next. So if I'm at 25% and I'm like, I think I need to hire another team member to grow, that may be okay because that may bump you up to 27, 28%. And that should realize over time because when we hire team members, it should realize like hiring a team member isn't just fun. It should equate to the growing business. Now, this can get people in trouble because there's a lot of you all who are so profit centric that it keeps you at a smaller practice, which isn't bad if that's your goals. I'm not saying it's a bad thing, But if you're so concentrated on keeping it at 20% or below 25%, then it can stunt your growth because you're not willing to let it grow up a little bit. I've seen practices that are 17%, 16%, and I'm going, oh, yeah, it could be wrong, but most likely in a situation like that, you're not reaching your full potential because you're under teamed on some level. Like you could do more with, you probably could produce more with hiring more team members. That would be like, I'd rather get 25% of $2 million than 17% of $1 million or $1.5 million. You kind of understand what I'm saying there. So like, I'm okay with letting that percentage grow up with it coming with a disproportional in a positive way production towards that percentage. So I want you to think about that as when you're in growth mode, you're going to be more towards 25 to 30%. When you're in optimize mode, you're going to be more towards 20 to 25%. And that mode of optimization and growth is a dance. It's a balance. It should never be fully in one unless you say, I'm done growing, I'm happy, I just want to be fully optimized till I get out of here. Then it's okay to stay at a certain level. But most of you, what you're probably going through if you're listening to this podcast is I want to grow. Then what you should do is have a period of optimization, restabilization. Think of this as like a chart that goes up, plateaus, up, plateaus, up, plateaus. What I did, which I don't recommend, is you just try to grow exponentially, like grow, and you never plateau. You'll burn yourself out. You burn team members out. It's more risk. Not recommended. If I do it all over again, and the bigger we've gotten, the better we've gotten at plateauing. It's easier to, your plateaus can be shorter when you're smaller, 1 million to 1.2. Stabilize 1.2, reassess my profitability. All right, we're good. Now we're going to go 1.2 to 1.8. When you start getting like 3 to 4, 4 to 5, those are harder optimizations to go, and so the growth should be slower. So I think this is pretty good so far. That part is, I'm impressed myself. So that's how I kind of look at it. The plateaus, keeping these benchmarks at 20% and 30%. I'm trying to fluctuate within there based off growth mode and optimization. Now, let's say I look at these numbers, my total team compensation with everything included, not just like your payroll. It's got to be everything included. And you're like, shoot, I'm at 32%. And I feel like I need to add a team member. Well, that's a problem. Because that tells us that our business profitability has not been dialed. And what I can tell you from experience is that if you think you can just grow out of bit of that, it's very hard. It's way easier to get it dialed when you're smaller than it is to grow the chaos and then try to optimize the chaos. It's better to grow a little chaos, optimize it. Grow a little chaos, optimize it. So if you're at that point, I would tell you, let's try to figure out how do we realize that number down before we make the jump up so we don't just compound the problem. No different than a golfer like myself, hits it in the woods. Every time I'm like, how am I going to like Bubba Watson at the Masters this shot to win this? Like every shot out of the woods to me is like, how can I become legendary? I don't run my practice that way. I should punch in the fairway, make the smart move, and then we'll move up the fairway rationally. For all you golfers, that analogy, I hope that hit home, made you smile a little bit. I don't know where Bubba Watson is now. That guy won the Masters and then went to Wild House and just lives the dream now. So anywho, I recognize now that I'm over my number. So then we have to make a decision, and this is important because we have to do an analysis to figure out, is my high team compensation percentage, is that a product of me being over-teamed, overpaying, or am I underproducing? That's a fixed number. Let's say it's 250. Well, to me to get it to $1 million, if I'm at 800 grand, then I'm probably, I got to decide, can I get to $1 million to make it fall into line and be normalized? Or am I just paying my people too much? So the first thing that we will do to look at that is not team compensation, because that's where everybody wants to go to, I think, is how do I cut team members? How do I lower pay? And all those options aren't great. Cutting team members tends to stunt growth. Lowering pay doesn't go over well. I can tell you that. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to look to see, am I underproducing? And the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to go basically provider and see are they hitting what their goal is or what their potential should be? We can start with hygiene. What I'll tell you is hygiene is a very, very easy one to usually get through because hygienists are going to produce somewhere around $12,000 to $15,000 in a PPO practice, maybe 15 to 20 in a fee-for-service practice. But like, that's it. Month to month, year over year. If you look back on your average of a hygienist year over year that worked the same amount of days, it's like the same thing. It's fascinating. Like they'll hit a number within like a crazy tight margin. It's nuts. But that's because they're typically insurance fixed. Well, they're definitely fixed on the procedure offerings they have. And so those numbers don't tend to flex. So you can't optimize hygiene or increase production that much. Frankly speaking, I think that's where a lot of consultants and coaches jack people up because they start telling them to look at how they can micro optimize a hygienist to do more SRP, sell more products. And therefore what they get is incremental growth. They take them from $15,000 a month to $16,000 a month. Oh, great. That was a $12,000 growth over the year. Gross production, not moving the needle, versus having them talk about things that actually move the needle, selling one more Invisalign clear aligner case a month, one more implant a month, one more sleep appliance a month. Those things actually start to move the needle. That's a podcast episode for a different day. So what I would tell you is then that gets us ultimately to the doctors. And now we're going to say, okay, where am I at from a doctor? And I'll use a doctor I just worked with on a call. He's about $120,000 a month, and his overhead's about 33%. $120,000 a month is practice. Team overhead is about 33%. First thing I did was go to his line item. He's averaging about $70,000 a month. That is typically going to be an immediate sign of underproducing. If you're a doctor with maybe any sort of advanced skill set, like you do one thing, maybe ortho, maybe you do an implant, maybe you do some extractions, grafting, maybe you do molar root canal, like not even a crazy skill set. Your benchmark numbers should be at least $80,000 a month. If you're not doing $80,000 a month, what I will tell you is that there are some fundamental issues there that are not being met. And I say this humbly because I see this in our own practice, that I've got associates 1 year out of school, 2 years out of school, etc. Not just one or two, like I've had multiple come through at 1 year or 2 year out that can routinely hit these numbers within the systems that we have doing general bread and butter dental school restorative dentistry. And so when I see that, that makes me immediately think, okay, there's a level of underproducing that needs to get fixed. Then you start to have questions. Are you busy? This goes back to the four fundamentals. Is this a diagnosis problem, a communication problem, a financial problem, or a scheduling problem? It will fall into one of those four things. And so then we'll work to do that. And this gets into kind of a unique thing about like, well, when do I bring on other doctors? Is I believe that like we should not bring on other doctors until we can routinely be hitting a minimum number that we're very comfortable with. Not a minimum number like I gotta make, like a minimum number that's comfortable. So like in most practices, I would tell you that if you're a single dentist and you're not hitting $80,000 a month consecutively, you're not ready to consider bringing on an associate. And the reason I say this is, where is their production going to come from? You may be like, well, I'm busy, but you can't give away your dentistry because you got to get your 80 grand. Or maybe you can get 70 grand, so now you can only give them away 10 grand. And there may be some pent up demand, but it's not an extra 50 grand a month, 60 grand a month typically. And so I'm a believer that the dentist should prove that by stretching themselves, going from 80 to 90 to 100, so that then when you bring in the associate, you could drop down to 70. That won't necessarily affect you too much personally. That's $30,000 overnight that gets transferred down to the associate. Now, let's play this story back. Let's say that this same doctor is not doing 70 grand a month, but they're doing 100 grand a month. 100 grand a month. Hygienists are doing what they should do a month. And now their overhead is still high. Then I would say, well, maybe this is a team compensation issue. So then we go look at team compensation and we say, okay, well, that's a little bit set by the market, right? I mean, like, I get hygienists are getting paid a crazy amount of money right now, but like, if that's what it's this supply and demand, if that's what hygienists go for in your area, then that's what they go for. We can bitch about that all we want and kind of whine, or we can be like, okay, I got to grow my practice into fitting that number. what you're going to see here is, as I circle back through this over and over and over, is that the majority of us out there have an underproducing issue, not a team compensation issue. And that's because it's typically twofold. One, it's either we're just in a very competitive market. Hygiene's competitive right now, and so it is hard to stay in good metrics in that area. Two is you have a long-term tenured team, or you bought a long-term tenured office, and so therefore you inherited people who are paid more than they should be for what they do. Those are hard because that's either a hard conversation about a new pay structure and or restructuring by firing and hiring someone else that is either going to get paid the same but do more, or cost less and do the same. So those are kind of things. But ultimately you find like, I just can't do that much in those areas. So now it's okay. Well, now how do I then grow my business? And if I'm already doing $100,000 a month and my overhead's still out of hand, that's when you start to look at your practice as a business and start to think, now maybe it's time that I bring in the second doctor, which gets into another whole rabbit hole conversation of like, well, I don't have enough space. I only have 5 ops and I have 3 hygienists. Now I work out of 2 chairs. And it's like, well, no, you need to rethink your strategy and how you produce, because if you're occupying 2 chairs and doing $100,000, I look at that as a business owner and I'm like, well, that's 2 dentists doing 50 grand. That's a dentist doing 50 grand out of each chair. That's not very good. I would rather you do 70 out of your chair and have another dentist do 70 out of the next chair. That's $140,000 a month. So we can't be held back by our mindset and how we start to look at our practices analytically and data-wise to figure out my numbers aren't in check, my compensation isn't good, I cannot whine about the cost to pay. It is what it is in most circumstances. So then how do I go out and find a new strategy to produce enough to get my metrics back into place so that I can be profitable? Which typically requires tough decisions, letting people go, hiring new people, coaching people to be better, getting rid of fake bonuses. Like, I am a huge believer of bonuses and paying my team members more as we grow. You cannot implement and pay out a bonus if you're above 30%. You can't. You really shouldn't be paying out a bonus until you're at 25%. But if you're super sweet and understand the cost of what you're doing, I'm a little okay with it between the 25 and 30% margin. But at some point, you're going to have to find a way to give your people more money because they don't want to just work harder and make the same. Like, I don't know about you, but I don't want that strategy. So at some point, you're going to have to paint a picture of how your team members can have a pathway to more money. But the only way that you can have a pathway to more money is if your metrics are already in line and you're below that 30% number. So if you're not below that 30% number, you got to make some most likely harder decisions to figure out what it is that I need to do to get that number in check. And most likely it's a new strategy in how I can be producing my problem versus trying to save myself, unless you're at a state in your practice where you're in optimization. There's a lot to unpack here. I feel like a lot of this I covered at a surface level, conceptually through a lot of things. My hope is that these are a little bit of like thought twisters, they make you kind of like, that challenges the way I think, but I don't totally get it. I would love for you to comment, send me a DM, slip into my DMs, and let me know what your thoughts are, your challenges are. What I really want you to do is join our app, pro.3d-dentist.com. This app is awesome. We already have about 500 dentists on the app. There's great conversation daily about treatment planning, different technologies in the practice, how to handle different things. It's a great platform without some of the drama and BS that you have on Facebook groups and these other groups. And ask questions on there. It's a free resource. There's not a lot of those types of resources out there these days that have that kind of good quality educational content that are free. So please come join us on the app. And I hope you enjoyed this episode. Work smarter, not harder. We'll see you next time.
Thank you for listening to The Millennial Dentist. Visit us online at millennialdentist.com.